just like that, 2020 is coming to a close. It's been a long, hard year for many of us in the capital region, and the future is far from certain. But before we head off into that horizon, we're going to take a moment in this final Eagle episode of the year to revisit some of 2020's top headlines.
The pandemic changed everything, virtually everything about the way we conduct our lives.
Also on this episode, we'll hear from the loved ones of local COVID victims.
But to actually be in the same room with her, none of us had done that since October. And unfortunately, she died alone at the hospital.
And on a lighter note, we'll talk to the Shenendehowa School District's famous Grapevine Lady.
I remember one time there was a question that they heard that we were getting a cappuccino and espresso bar in the high school. You know, it's like, no.
This is The Eagle, a Times Union podcast, a look inside our newsroom. I'm Jessica Marshall.
If you're enjoying this podcast, take advantage of all the Times Union has to offer and support our efforts to bring in you award-winning journalism by becoming a Times Union member today. Go to timesunion.com/subscribe.
Welcome to The Eagle. I'm Jessica Marshall. Normally, we'd begin with a look at what appeared in the Times Union and on timesunion.com this week, but we're making an exception. We are here once again with Casey Seiler, Times Union editor. Now, it's the last week of 2020 and kind of the end of what's fair to say a highly fraught year. It's also our 40th episode of the Eagle podcast, which is something worth celebrating, of course. But I'd say that it's a good time right now to look back on the year's top stories. And you and I have talked about many of these on prior episodes, so some of them might sound familiar to our faithful listeners. But they do bear highlighting again, given the impact they've made on the region in the last year. So let's start with the big one, the one we can't avoid, the one that kind of touches on all of the other ones, the pandemic. Now, just this week, the governor called out the capital region as having one of the highest COVID positivity rates in the state. So that's not a great sign ending the year. But can you kind of give us a look back on how we dealt with the pandemic this year?
First of all, I just love your use of the word fraught to describe 2020. And for those who want to hear a different word, they can switch over to the NC-17 version of this podcast. But
yes,
I mean, look, the 2020 is going to go down as the year in not just New York history or upstate history or American history, but really world history as the year of the pandemic. You know, in the same way we talk about the 1918, 1919 Spanish flu pandemic, this is a year that is going to be one of those signposts like 1941. And the pandemic changed everything. Virtually everything about the way we conduct our lives has been upended or tweaked in ways large and small. That is why half, if not more, of the stories on our list of major stories, and we are trying to this year avoid the use of a kind of top 10 countdown way of going about this, all have to do with the pandemic. You know, the damage to businesses, the upending of the education system, you know, you name it. And we're talking early in the week, but it's not giving really anything away to note that the final story of this year's series of major stories is going to be about the human loss of the pandemic. All of the people in the capital region who have lost their lives, you know, younger people, certainly the majority of them in our area, elderly, who have been taken away by COVID-19.
Now, we'll have more on that story coming up later this episode, so stay tuned for that. But moving on to another one of our top stories, Keith Raniere was sentenced, and a whole lot of stuff happened with NXIVM this year. So do you want to go through some of the highlights there?
This was the year, we're now talking more than a year and a half after Raniere's the guilty verdict, guilty on all counts, of course, and It's almost 2 years now since Ranieri's other co-defendants, the women who said they would never abandoned him and took guilty verdicts. Or I guess I should say abandoned him in part, because many of them, Claire Bronfman most notably, when she appeared for her sentencing, could not fully disassociate herself from Ranieri and from NXIVM. But the big story of the year was the victims of NXIVM, most of them, almost all of them, women, again, who confronted Ranieri in court at his sentencing at the end of October and told him in no uncertain terms how he had wrecked their lives. And they were all there in the courthouse where he was sentenced to a prison term that will go well beyond his natural life if it stands. He's appealing it, but it's a rather thin reed of legal arguments that he is using to appeal that sentencing.
Now, of course, all the NXIVM news kind of thrust, or rethrust, I should say, the Times-Union into the national spotlight, because the paper had played a large role over the years in breaking the stories about NXIVM. But if you want to hear more about our coverage of the NXIVM saga, go ahead and download our NXIVM on Trial podcast. Next on our list, over the summer, Black Lives Matter and the protests associated with police violence, it touched the capital region. You were there for it. You were in the midst of some, to use the word again, fraught situations. Do you want to talk about how all of that got coverage this past year?
Yeah, the death of George Floyd and the death of Breonna Taylor were just two of the flashpoints that set off the protests that really swept across the country in May and into June. It was a long summer of racial reconciliation, or at least a reckoning with police misconduct and the damage done to Black communities by injustice, and it resulted in definite legislative changes, including the demise or the significant scaling back of the state law known as 50A that previously blocked the release of most police personnel records. That is now washed away, although the battle for transparency will go on. Communities were obligated to take a very hard look at the way that their law enforcement entities went about policing, and that process is ongoing. But it was a year in which America was reminded once again that it still has a long way to go before we live in a society that is as equitable and just as at least well-thinking people in our communities want them to be.
And now a reminder, of course, you can read all of our coverage on this and all the other stories that we talk about at timesunion.com. Moving on to the Skohari limo crash of 2018, the NTSB finally released its long-awaited report. What are the developments in that story this year?
Well, the report found that, no surprise, as our Larry Rulison has reported through his good investigative work, that the stretch limousine that was involved in the crash, where 20 people died, 17 passengers, the driver, and 2 pedestrians in the parking lot of the country store out in Skohari that the limo ripped through before landing in a ditch. The limo was rickety, that it had not been kept up to anything close to where it should have been based on both state and federal regulation. And that is why the operator of Prestige Limousine, Nauman Hussein, is still facing 20 counts apiece of manslaughter and of criminally negligent homicide. Those charges are still pending against him. We, of course, hear talk of a potential plea bargain, but nothing has borne fruit yet. But the NTSB devoted a significant portion of the report to failings by the state, in particular the State Department of Transportation and the Department of Motor Vehicles, which did, in the estimation of the NTSB and in the estimation of the Times-Union, which has spent a long time looking at this, a fairly shabby job of regulating this company. Virtually all of the state's enforcement tactics were insufficient to keep it off the road. The state on numerous occasions missed an opportunity to get that vehicle off the road. And that is unfortunately why it was still available for rent in early October of 2018.
All right, here's our last topic, I promise, that's somewhat negative before we move on to some positive things that came out of 2020. This year, we saw a significant uptick in violence around the region. Can you take us through what we reported on that?
Yeah, especially in Albany, but also in Schenectady and Troy, there were disturbing increases in gun violence and near record number of fatalities of homicides. One of the most high profile was a young child who was shot dead in Troy, apparently by a stray bullet. But there were violent incidents really all across the region. If you spoke to city leaders, including law enforcement leaders, they attributed at least some of it to the fact that community engagement was largely curtailed because of the pandemic. That, for example, the groups known as sort of violence interrupters were unable to do their work in a really robust way because the one-on-one contact that makes it possible was just pretty much suspended by the pandemic. But once again, you have a problem of too many guns on the street, many of them illegal, combined with a significant downturn in the economy and people cooped up potentially where beefs are allowed to fester and take on disproportionate importance. And it added up tragically to a lot of people hurt and a disturbing number of people dead.
Well, that was a number of sobering stories for sure. Important stories, but sobering, and not necessarily positive. So let's talk about something a little more positive. As you mentioned before, the pandemic affected a lot of things, nearly all of the things in our lives. It changed our lives. That includes the Saratoga season at the Saratoga race course, which was very much altered. No fans were allowed in, but we had hometown horse become something of a star this year. Do you want to talk about good old Tiz the Law?
Yeah, as Tim Wilkin, our retiring sports writer, not saying that he's shy and withdrawn, but that he is in fact headed into retirement from the Times-Union, reported throughout the summer, Tiz the Law was this phenomenal horse with seemingly, bottomless ability, who seemed like would become a Triple Crown winner potentially, that alas fell just short at the delayed Kentucky Derby, or significantly short, I guess we should say, but still a horse that made for an interesting, entertaining, and exciting Saratoga meet that otherwise just would have been miserable, with no fans in the stands and no hat competition or any of that stuff. So once again, we are saved by the animal kingdom, at least in terms of the Saratoga race course.
Indeed. And now let's end on a positive note, of course. There is good news related to the pandemic in that we are getting through this. Can you elaborate?
It feels right now sort of as we're all looking back at this year that we got through. It's been 10 months or more since the pandemic really sort of sailed into our consciousness like a big black cloud. And we are now confronting a world where the vaccines are beginning to roll out. We see a light at the end of the tunnel, while at the same time we're dealing with this terrible spike that, at least in the capital region, is making the pandemic far more deadly and more dangerous than it has been before. Other parts of the country are dealing with very much the same kinds of things. The numbers are definitely going in the wrong direction. At the same time, I think we all look back at the political year just ended and we feel a sense of having endured and having gotten through that. For all the ways in which humanity can create problems for itself, we also have shown the ability to solve at least some of those problems and get ourselves out of it. And who knows, Jess, perhaps we can look back on this and just want to forget it, in the same way that they say that people after the Spanish flu pandemic of a century ago just wanted to forget about it. And so there's this big kind of, empty page, as it were, in the history books that people just didn't talk about it for years and years. Say what you will about the social media generation, but you get the sense that people are going to want to turn the page from the pandemic, but you don't think they're going to forget it anytime soon. And, if you're a glass half full person, you can say that perhaps people will start thinking of global problems and looking for global solutions a little bit more than we have in the past. I mean, that's one thing that a pandemic definitely brings home to you, that a problem in one part of the world could potentially end up being a problem in this part of the world as well.
Well, I say that's a good place to end it today, in the end of 2020. Happy New Year, Casey. We will touch back with you in 2021.
Jess, you too, and thanks for all the great work.
As of this podcast's taping, the Capital Region has lost nearly 530 people to COVID-19 since the pandemic began 10 months ago. The Times-Union published a special memorial this week to those who succumbed to the virus, highlighting some of their stories. Reporter Wendy Liberator was one of the reporters who compiled the stories, and I talked to her about the experience.
Statewide deaths 114, the hospitalizations up 376.
Over the last 5 days, there's been an average of 200.8 new positive cases. Yesterday it was 201.2.
Every day we see and hear these really sobering headlines, mainly coming from public officials who, each day have a press conference and they quote these grim numbers of the COVID infection rates and the COVID deaths. But we don't get to drill down often and hear the stories of those people who are directly affected by the COVID deaths. Now, that's something that you've been looking into and have written about. So can you give me a general sense of what this article is trying to do?
Well, this article is going to memorialize many of the folks who have died of COVID-19 in the Capital Region. I mean, it really only skims the surface. Maybe there's like 20 names that we've picked out, because far more have died than that. But we tried to get a cross section of ages and genders. And basically every story is different on how it happened. Of course, they all died in the end, which is so tremendously sad.
So I'm the one that caught the COVID, didn't realize what it was until it was too late.
But he did go out to eat one night. Unfortunately, the establishment, which I will not name, some of the staff did test positive.
He was a man that was in a lot of pain with his arm, and that's why he decided to have the surgery, which apparently was a very big mistake.
Some folks got it from having elective surgery. For example, one man had shoulder surgery. Other people got it from dining out. Others got it because they're nursing home residents and they got it there. Of course, it comes to an end with death, which is really sad for all the families involved. It's still very raw for many of the survivors.
I said, I need to see him. I said, well, whether it's on Facebook or what, I said, I need to see my brother. And they said, you can come up. I think he was cognizant that I was there, although, you can't tell necessarily at that stage, but it brought me great peace.
What was it like for you calling up folks who, have had deaths in the family? What was that like?
It was difficult because often they're crying. And they're trying to they keep saying, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. They're just choking on their words because they're so upset still. One man I talked to was angry, really angry over it because his mother, he said, was super meticulous, clean woman, was really into the mask wearing and social distancing. He hadn't seen his mother for practically a year before she died because she was so concerned about COVID. But she needed surgery. She got surgery, got COVID at a rehab center and died. And he's very angry. Another woman I talked to, her husband died after being in a rehab facility after surgery. She feels like the rehab center was negligent. She's considering taking legal action. But there's other people, another woman telling me about her mom who was in Samaritan Hospital, the same hospital this woman worked at for 35 years, and how much love and care her mother got there. But at the same time, this woman couldn't spend any time with her mother.
I mean, I could see her that way through phone calls, but to actually be in the same room with her, none of us had done that since October. And unfortunately, she died alone at the hospital.
It doesn't matter what kind of care they got. I guess in the end, if you're not there to hold their hand, or you're holding their hand through a glove, which a lot of people were allowed to go into Albany Med to say farewell to family members. But it's just heart-wrenching. It's heart-wrenching for me too.
Yes, I mean, sort of tearing up just listening to you talk here. It's very hard to hear and even harder to go through. Can you tell me about the process of sort of finding these folks to feature in this story?
Basically, what we did was go through the obituaries in the Times-Union and seek all those that died of COVID. And then I just went about going through the survivor lists in the obituaries and just trying to find phone numbers for every single person I could among the survivors and reaching out to them. I talked to spouses, I talked to siblings, I talked to children of the COVID victim, and sometimes you can't find any number, but I just kept drilling down farther until I found a number, called it blindly, and hoped that they would talk to me. And all of them were able to once they composed themselves.
Yeah, I was wondering that. I was wondering how willing they were to speak about their stories.
I was surprised. They were very willing to speak to it, except for the one angry man who wanted to check me out first to make sure I wasn't somebody who was going to try to bilk his 92-year-old father out of money for this. But otherwise, everybody was very willing to talk. And it's funny, I had a list of people who died more recently. They all died in November and December. So this is
still fresh.
Yes.
Wow. What do you hope people get out of this? Something you hope that they can take away from it?
Well, first of all, the COVID is serious. It's interesting. One of the things that almost all of them said to me was, I don't want to get political about this, but, and then they went on to say, you have to wear a mask. This is real.
At the end of the day, it was still COVID.
Yes.
It was COVID that sent him to the hospital. And COVID is listed on his death certificate.
It's almost like they were telling me, my brother, my mother died of COVID. This is not nonsense. This is COVID. It's on their death certificate. I found it very interesting that they had to tell me this, because I've interviewed a lot of people for tragic events over the years, but none of them had to emphasize to me that what it says on the death certificate, and that that their death is not a political ploy, which I thought was really sad.
Wow.
COVID seems to be everywhere, and these folks got it in a variety of ways. The ages are all over the place. It's young people, old people. Like one woman said to me in the end, she's like, wear a mask and socially distance, please. That was the main message out of it, that this is real, and we all must take care of ourselves so we can take care of each other.
After the break, we'll talk to the famous Grapevine Lady of Shenendehowa Schools.
Hi, I'm Casey Seiler, editor of the Times-Union. Join us for an ongoing discussion on major developments in the saga of Keith Raniere, co-founder of NXIVM, the shadowy Upstate New York organization at the center of the explosive federal investigation that resulted in his conviction on charges of extortion, sex trafficking, and more. We talked to former members of NXIVM, discuss the latest news, and preview the likely next twists in this bizarre and disturbing story. You can find NXIVM on Trial at timesunion.com or wherever you listen to podcasts.
If you're a student, parent, or faculty member at a Shenendehowa school or have been in the past, you've likely heard of the Grapevine Lady. By Grapevine Lady, we mean Kelly DeFicciani, the district's spokeswoman for several decades. Back in 2006, she created an award-winning blog called Heard It Through the Grapevine. It was designed to give the Shen community a forum to ask questions about the district and to get answers. The blog became famous, as everything was fair game, from inquiries about school policy to queries about where the school cafeterias got their buffalo chicken pizza. DeFicciani is retiring in January, and education reporter Rachel Silberstein spoke to her recently about the impact of her work and who will take over the Grapevine.
Shenendehowa is like one of the largest districts. There's like multiple campuses. People find it really confusing. So what sort of spawned this idea to start a blog that answers people's questions? No questions too small, no questions too stupid. Anything they ask is addressed on the Grapevine.
My kids went through the system, and I would be at ball games or concerts or just different activities throughout the district pretty regularly. And I would hear people, talking in the background to each other, asking questions about the district. And a lot of people would act like they were experts and they'd answer their friends' questions, and I'd be hearing it and the answer would be wrong. So I approached the superintendent, and plus a lot of rumors and that kind of stuff. I had approached the superintendent, Dr. Robinson, years ago with this idea, and he was on board, and we began the Grapevine, and it kind of snowballed from there.
I mean, in 2000, that was like right at the start of the internet. Like blogs were just starting to come up. That's pretty like cutting edge that Shenendehowa was like on the front of the blog trend.
Yeah, at the time, a lot of schools, because through the BOCES consortium, you have conversations about things, and a lot of schools thought we were nuts. People love it. I mean, it's always our highest page in our Google Analytics, and it's a place where people can go. Our school is so big. A lot of times people don't even know where to call for an answer to, like you said, some are very simple questions. So it's a place that they can, just quickly send out a note. A lot of people read it for entertainment. I get a lot of people saying it's their favorite thing to read and go through and see some of the questions and responses. But
it's my favorite thing to read, and I don't even go to Shenendehowa, so
yeah, we hear that a lot.
And I love how frank you are, and you'll just address, you're not afraid of any question. People, some of them are angry. A lot of times it's just parents or students venting about something that happened that day, and you just address it head on. Like, what made you decide to make that sort of editorial decision to take any question?
If it was going to work, we had to take the personal out of it and realize that these are things people are saying and questioning every day, and it's better for us to know about it and to be able to address it than to just, cover our eyes and ears and not know what's going on. So it helps guide us in a lot of things, but you do have to keep that whole thing that it's just not personal. You can't take it personally.
It just gives the whole district like an air of transparency and like creates trust between the community and the administrators. And in the grand scheme of things, what has it like evolved at all? Has it sort of like shifted as you served a different purpose over the years?
Well, it's funny because when I first started, the biggest part of my job was working with the media. And it was because people in our community would constantly contact your tip lines,
Right.
and report different things. We had, like, if you look at the beginning of my career, we had binders this big filled with press stories about us. And that really dropped drastically when we started the Grapevine, because people started realizing they could get answers from us directly and kind of let us know how they were feeling. And so I think it really helped to give people confidence in that we will respond to things. They don't have to go, to the press. They can come directly to us.
To get something done. Yeah. So when someone writes you, sometimes, people are angry or they're upset about something that happened that day and they're really just venting, and you'll write like, thank you for the feedback. What do you do with that feedback? Does it get to someone?
Yes. So any question that comes in automatically gets sent to whatever administrator. I send it to whatever administrator is involved. If I can answer it myself, I answer it myself. If it's a little bit more complicated, then the administrator will provide an answer and I'll go in and edit it. So they see everything that comes in about their school or their program or whatever. So they're aware of what people are thinking and can address things.
There's a lot of people writing in that they're really sad to see you go and how much they love your work over the years. Was this planned before COVID?
Yeah, with the state, you get 30-year, and I have 30 years in the system, so that's pretty much what. Although COVID did probably help it along a little bit.
It must be nice to get all those letters and realize sort of the impact you've had over the years.
It is. It's really nice. A lot of times, when you get criticism or whatever on the Grapevine, you have to balance it with, we get a lot of positive on it as well.
Seems fun. Like, you're probably laughing a lot. Some of those questions just crack me up.
My favorite is the student fan base. I mean, that it's so funny how many students will write me and tell me how much they love the Grapevine. So
I love any question that says, I'm in the 4th grade.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Exactly.
What's sort of like the top 10? Like, what are some of your favorite questions that you've gotten over the years that were kind of over the top?
It always cracks me up how much people want to know recipes from our food service department.
Wow, that's a high compliment.
They want to know like where we buy a certain chicken nugget or where, and those are the kind of questions that to me are fun. Like, because, you wouldn't call somebody up and ask that question, but it's a place they can get an answer to it.
Wow, so people can like order their nostalgic like lunchroom chicken nugget. That's amazing.
Yep.
Only at Shenendehowa.
Exactly. Or when it's like rumors that just you're like, where the heck did that come from? Like, I remember one time there was a question that they heard that we were getting a cappuccino and espresso bar in the high school. Like, no.
Good idea. I feel like it's more like a suggestion than a rumor.
Probably.
What's going to happen to the Grapevine once you leave? Like, are you worried that it won't be maintained?
I'm not worried about anything once I leave. I think it's time for a new person. I've been there a long time, and wherever they take the position, a lot of things are changing. I mean, when I first started, like I said, the biggest part of my job was working with the media and print publications. I used to do 11 newsletters a year. Now it's down to 2. This job has changed drastically with technology, and I think it's going to continue to evolve with whoever replaces me. So if they decide there's a better way to do things, more power to them.
So do you think, like, growing up, do you think like kids that were in your kids' class, did they see you as the Grapevine Lady, or did they understand what the full scope of your job was?
No, I think they're
just the Grapevine Lady.
Yeah, and in fact, people introduce me that way all the time. They'll say, "This is Kelly DeFisciani. She's the Grapevine Lady."
That's so funny.
Yeah.
I reach out to you. I'm like, "Can you connect me with the Grapevine Lady? Because I heard she's retiring." And you're like, "That's me." Like, you're a celebrity.
Sometimes when people say, when people ask me the question, "Who does the Grapevine?" sometimes I just want to say Oz. So, I'm the mighty Oz behind the grapevine.
That's it for this week. I'm Jessica Marshall. We'll be back next week and next year with another look inside the newsroom here at the Times-Union. In the meantime, check us out on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram, or head over to timesunion.com for the latest news and features. And happy 2021, everybody!